Welcome back to The Modern CEO. Today we're taking a deep look into a role that's becoming increasingly valuable for organisations that operate at scale, the Chief of Staff. It's a role many are curious about, but not many really truly understand, and I'm joined by two guests to help us lift the lid. Firstly, Catherine Shepherd, an exceptional Chief of Staff with brilliant, honest, behind-the-scenes view of what really takes to amplify a principal or a CEO's impact. Cat gives us a clear view of what the job really involves, from day-to-day operations and project flow to firefighting alignment and the invisible work that keeps a leadership team moving in the same direction. And alongside Cat is Nick from the Chief of Staff Association. Nick brings a wider perspective, how the role is evolving globally, what organisations typically get wrong, and the patterns they see across hundreds of Chief of Staff and their principals. And we cover a lot. How a Chief of Staff actually supports and extends their principal or CEO, where the role delivers more value, and how trust and authority are built, when a business is ready for a Chief of Staff, and finally how to spot someone who generally thrive in that position. It's a practical and really honest look at a role that more CEOs are considering. So let's get to it. Here's the Modern CEO's Guide to the Chief of Staff. Welcome both of you to the show. Good to have you both here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having us.
Good to see you. So, Catherine, let's start with you. I think a lot of the listeners here would be really curious to know, what does a day in the life of a Chief of Staff actually look like? What do you kind of get up to day?
So I would split it into two buckets. There's your average BAU, stuff that happens every day, and then there's your crisis, your problems, your projects that you fit in around those areas. So first thing in the morning, same as most people, I check my emails, my inbox, quick sync with leadership if it's needed, if anything's come in overnight. Certainly in a global organisation, that quite often happens. I have lots of projects that I stand point on, so I have regular project check-ins with the relevant individuals. I'm pretty strict on my cadences, so everybody knows when those calls are going to happen. Stakeholder engagement is something that's sort of peripheral to everything that I do, so there's nearly always a call that arises as a consequence of one of these check-ins. By the way, did you know that's turned to amber? Or, hey, we're now green on this. Isn't this amazing? So that can sometimes dictate how my day unfolds. And then at the end, I have a lot of mentors in my role. I reach out to a lot of the junior EAs to try and help them either take a career step or just have some exposure to what it's like in the upper echelon, so to speak, of an organisation. And then the rest of my day, I tend to leave free. So for whether it's thinking time or touching base with people, there's nearly always something that will arise at some point in the day. And I'm very flexible from a timescale perspective. That's really important in a global organisation, to have that freedom.
Okay. I've got a bunch of questions about that. And you mentioned stakeholders. Who are they? Who are the stakeholders that you spend most of your time working with?
So it's a broad spread. I have a lot of interaction with what I would define as the leadership team, which will be called different things in different organisations. My principal, we speak multiple times across the day, email, Teams, phone calls, sometimes face-to-face if we're in person and in 3D together. The rest of the times, it's either somebody who requires an output from one of my projects, so operations, people, marketing, anywhere where there's sort of cross-collaboration and I'm acting as that conduit, they're my stakeholders. But my stakeholders change dependent on what's required or what is happening in the business at any given time. So I'm very flexible. I know everybody, and you dip in and pick them up as needed.
You mentioned projects. Are these your projects you're managing? Where do they sit? Are these your things? Are these things you're kind of moving along? Where do these sit in terms of ownership with the Chief of Staff that you are?
Yeah, it's a mix, Joe, to be honest. I have some projects that I own. However, the reality is they're ultimately a project for either a leader or a principal that they've given to me. Nearly always where it's either that there's technical limitations or it's cross-collaboration or there's so many different parties, actually that coordination is just too much for anybody else to be distracted, say a P&L owner or whatever it may be. So it tends to be complicated cross-collaboration type projects that come to me as the sort of facilitator. And then I have some standalone projects, things like corporate reporting, stuff that is pertinent to my particular leader. I own and I control those areas. So it might be there's a problem in X, can I have some analysis? There's an issue over here, can we identify what the problem is? But those projects tend to be quite thick and fast, and I tend to hand over the things that come to me that are broken, that I kind of put together and stitch up. I'll then hand over to actually the rightful owner to move on, and then I'll move on to the next item as required.
Okay. And so how much of your day then is fixed in terms of like meetings and stuff like that versus the fixing side of it? How much is ad hoc? I'm curious. What's the sort of breakdown there?
Probably about 70-30, so 30 fixed, 70 ad hoc, because a lot of what I do is reactionary. So it's like, that's on fire, quick, Kat, go and have a look, see what it is, get me an analysis, and then we'll work out what the next steps are. But then my sort of standard calls are my check-ins with my leaders, check-ins with my team, and standard sort of governance cadence style meetings where you'll have a monthly business review or a quarterly business review or strategic alignment meeting like that. They tend to be my staple, set in the diary and fixed. The rest is fairly fluid. It's not necessarily the right way, but I do have an open door policy, so I'm always contactable. And so my diary can fill up quite quickly, albeit it might not be a regular meeting that is a consequence of that.
Okay, I see. And you mentioned a couple of things there. Your team. So who's on the team of a chief
Everybody,
of staff?
and everybody reports to me. So I have, the way I sort of look at my role, Joe, just to give it some context, is I think it's really important as a chief of staff to know what you don't know. And so I build a team around me that I can dip in on. I can move my way around a P&L. I couldn't build one from the bottom up. So I know who to talk to in finance. Operationally, I need to know who can help me in certain areas, whether it's process, whether it's Six Sigma, whether it's efficiencies or whatever it may be. I go to those people. I perceive those as my team. I do have a small team of individuals who help me from a reporting perspective, so data analysts, business analysts, but I also deploy them, if that's the right terminology, across the business to help identify areas that need attention, and then they'll come back and then off they'll go on the next sort of mission, so to speak.
Oh, okay, interesting. So I'm going to summarize here and tell me if I get this right or I get this wrong. You're typically then quite project led in terms of the way you work things. So you're working on projects, parts of what you do, but you've also kind of almost got this fixer role. Is the fixer role in and around the projects, or does that sit outside or overlap? I'm curious of those two sides of what you do.
It can be a hybrid, Joe, okay? So it depends. I mean, my project roles are very transient, right? I keep them, I fix them, I move them on. And then there's other areas where it might be, okay, we're looking to do X or Y in the organisation. What is that going to look like? Give me some optionality. So there can be broader sort of analysis type pieces of work. Or it might be organisational restructures. It might be transformational projects. Sometimes it's just alignment where people have gone off and got really excited about something and you're like, whoa, hang on a minute. Let's just get back to what the key deliverable is. So a lot of it is also making sure that the strategic direction of leaders in whatever organisation you're in is still the correct mantra across the team, and you keep people true to that story.
Okay, interesting. Right. I'm going to expand this a bit. So we've had a delve into Kat's day to day there and what it's like to be her version of a chief of staff. Nick, can you expand on that? What are the other sort of models or ways of being a chief of staff? Are all chief of staff like Kat? Is there other and different ways of being this kind of person within an organisation?
Kat is without parallel as a chief of staff. No other chief of staff could be quite like Kat.
Yay!
But no, of course, the answer has to be yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are some, I think, core consistencies across the various contexts and settings in which you might find a chief of staff role. But of course, it differs across the industry, the sector that you're operating within, and then beyond that as well, the region, where in the world you're doing this role. And that can, I think, the sort of expectations around what a chief of staff has to bring to the table based on what market you're talking about is interesting. But fundamental to the role and sort of core to its DNA is that project management, the cross-collaboration, the cross-functional coordination piece that's defined a big part of what Kat's day-to-day is dominated with. I think fundamentally the chief of staff role is there supporting ultimately a principal, a senior executive, chief executive, possibly multiple. There might be some explicit or implicit interaction with the board and communications with a board structure. Sometimes there can be a chief of staff reporting into a chief operations officer, and often those two roles are conflated, and we can get into perhaps the detail there as to where the divisions lie. But ultimately, day to day, whatever the rhythms of the role might look like, the responsibilities as a chief of staff are pretty consistent. You're there to improve decision making, to find efficiencies when it comes to better processes, better team collaboration, as ensuring that the right hand's talking to the left. And I think in that sense, Kat's mentioned stakeholder engagement. It is not least a relationships focused role. And I think your ability to engage effectively with stakeholders, the principal's a stakeholder, everyone else in the organization's a stakeholder, I think as well the external audience, that increasingly, depending on your sector, of course, but increasingly a big part of the role is that reputation management and the crisis response, if that's a feature of your organization's day-to-day sort of situational awareness, I guess. So having the ability to coordinate across different projects, to engage stakeholders effectively, and ultimately communicate what it is that the leadership team is there to do. So you're bringing people along with you, you're articulating that vision that the chief executive's outlined, and you're getting that buy-in, which is so crucial to ensuring that the team can deliver on what the leadership apparatus has outlined for the company.
Okay, interesting. So, because I'm curious as well, so a lot of the work I do with the CEOs I work with, one of the things I always tell them is your team's really small, right? You have probably one of the smallest teams in the organization as the CEO. And so how does the role of a chief of staff, okay, I guess, deliver the most value for a CEO? How does it deliver and make the CEO or the principal more effective in terms of what they do?
So I think it's a good one. We often put these sorts of questions to our members. Year to year, we put out these reports, and behind those reports, we survey both our membership and broader industry, any chief of staff that can contribute to identifying some key trends of what is delivering value for their principal. We want to hear from them. And some key themes, I think, emerge each time we run those surveys. I think the first thing is, again, to come back to that foundation of better decision making. The outcome of having a chief of staff is to lead more effectively. And I think part of that is reducing noise around the office of the CEO. So not everything obviously needs to get to the CEO's desk. And I think the ability of a really effective chief of staff is to act as that filter and really clarify exactly what actually needs to be elevated to the boss, or if it's something that can be handled by the chief of staff themselves. And that obviously depends a bit on, I guess, authorised environment. Do you have your delegated authority to do that, or is it something that you might need to perhaps grow into? And a huge part of the role is trust that comes over time, as I'm sure Kat can.
So, Kat, could you fill in a bit of colour around this? Tell me, does this sound familiar to you? Talk me through the realities of this. Where do you think you offer the most value there in terms of what you do?
So I think there's a couple of points, okay? And one of the most important ones is I keep the noise from the door. The emails, the questions, the can I just, what if, the but. So take a scenario where somebody's not sure, and it's nearly always about delivering bad news, right? Oh, this has happened, I'm not sure how to frame it. One of the things that I think is really, really integral to the role is we act as strategic and trusted advisors to our principals, but we have that equal responsibility to their teams and subsequent teams and teams lower down in the business. And the trust and the integrity that you develop allows people to come to you and say, this has happened, I think I've got a solution, how do we drive it forward? And your secret sauce, if you like, as the chief of staff, is your ability to say, yeah, I know where, Bob, let's call him Bob, the boss, I know where his mind is, go away and action it, that's fine, I can make a call on that. As well as being able to say, do you know what, I have visibility on a couple of other things that are happening on the horizon, you need to move that up the list and you should cover that in your one-to-one. And I also think, just to add to something that Nick was saying, is it's your ability to disseminate the correct information to the correct audience at the right time. A crisis in somebody's eyes is not a crisis in somebody else's eyes. And it's that ability to say, I know it's horrible, trust me, let's do it like this, and we can come up with a solution. That way, the things that I put in front of my leaders or my principals, and I have used this methodology over the years, allows me to say, this happened, I've talked to the people, there's a team in place, this is the plan, unless you tell me otherwise, this is resolved, and I'm giving it to you for information, versus, I can't fix this, boss, I need some direction, he'll give it to me, or she'll give it to me, and then away we go, and you become an implementer. So you basically enhance their effectiveness, because my job is to fight the fires and the problems and either go with a solution or know when I'm asking for help. And that clears out so much time in somebody's diary. It is actually a real tangible benefit. It takes time, and you learn how a principal works. Some people like face-to-face, some people like an email, some people like Teams. You evolve into your best communication, but you amplify their efficiency in being that gatekeeper, that sort of keeping the wolves from the doors, if you like.
I love that way of talking about amplifying their efficiencies. That's a really nice way to look at it. So Nick mentioned there the sort of build up of trust and that handover of trust and to a certain extent authority. Could you talk us through that? How does that happen, right? So if you're a CEO, it's kind of, that must be quite slightly nerve-wracking to be able to give over some of that. Talk me through how that's been for you, Kat, in terms of your experiences.
So I think being really open and honest, the role of a chief of staff, whether it's a CEO, a president, a COO, a head of people, or whatever the name is, it is fundamentally based on relationship. Yeah, you know, we're all human. You can get in a room and be like, oh, not sure this is going to work, or, you know, I'm not quite aligned in that. You can evolve, but it is really important that you're open and honest initially. What do you know? What do you don't know? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Because that way you set yourself up for success, but you also set your principal up for success, right? And trust comes from delivering on time, being honest, but also being quite open. So, hang on, that's gone wrong. I had a bad judgment call here. Let me go away and fix it. I've got a solution. No need to panic. Yeah, it's that consistency of humility, I think, to say, we get things wrong. We've tried our best. Don't panic. We can fix this. As well as being able to say, once somebody gives me an instruction, and I would wager that every one of my principals in, you know, across my career would say it was a done deal and it's off their plate. That is what feeds that efficiency, right? And it takes time. Absolutely, it takes time. And it's hard. It takes effort.
Okay, so talk us through, Nick. So how do you know, what kind of the signs that a business is ready for a chief of staff? So at what point, you know, do people contact you to say, I think we're ready for this? How does a CEO or a leader or a principal know it's time, or the time is right to hire a chief of staff?
I wish more would come and sort of actively say, we need one. Often it takes, they're the enlightened ones that do, and it's part of our job to explain, you know, where that need might arise. I think it does vary. To Kat's point, I think, you know, finding those efficiencies, it is about saving time. It's about saving the boss's time. And I think as soon as a CEO, regardless of their broader setting, is spending too much of their time kind of in the nitty-gritty, coordinating teams instead of actually leading, I think that's a generally pretty good indicator that we might need someone there that is there to ensure that information is consolidated, it's not scattered, it's that the decisions that are made in meetings are actually followed up upon. And I think as well, it will come down to perhaps the growth stage that a company might find itself in. So when those growing pains are adding this layer of complexity, I guess, that's stretching the current leadership resourcing or structure, that's typically, I think, when a chief of staff might need to. And in a tech context, that might come into play when the headcount is moving beyond that sort of 30 to 50 mark we find. That can look differently in other settings. But essentially, it's when teams will need that kind of single point of focus to have that vision clearly articulated so that they can go off and implement those in their various functions. And the CEO needs that space, not to be bogged down by the day-to-day, but actually to lead. And I think that's when the chief of staff becomes a logical next step.
Okay, so it's at that point where the CEO's in that point where they're doing lots of work, lots of coordination, lots of decision making, almost the work is getting on top of them, and they need that space again to think
Correct.
more strategically, to lead more. Their day to day is getting too much for them in terms of what they're trying to do.
I think I would
Right.
just add one more thing, Joe, as
Okay.
well, if I can. And I think also as well, sometimes it's when leadership struggles with alignment and things like decision velocity. There's lots of different methodologies across organisations around spans and layers. How many people should have direct reports? How many people should be in whatever area of the organisation? I think another time where a chief of staff is really valuable is when businesses are undergoing really deep transformation and really large organisational pivots. Because if you have that one person that you turn to as your confidant, they become also a bit of a culture icon. They're that person who eats, sleeps, breathes what you're trying to deliver and endeavour. And I think when you bring that person in, the leadership team do naturally gravitate towards that person because they want to check things out, they want to run things by. And if that person is always telling the same story as the principal, it speeds things along and it helps people realise, okay, I can ask that question and it's not disruptive. And it does allow a principal to set strategy and then let the people run with it and roll with it. I think that's really key. It does massively benefit from an alignment perspective and certainly decision making.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. It's a great way to think about it. There's kind of moments of truth.
Joe, I was just going to say that the reporting structure as well is something that's really interesting to observe over time in a chief of staff. And I think it does change. It's not just mapping the journey of the organisation and identifying the point at which a chief of staff should actually be hired, but the role itself will shift, I think, as well, depending on how long you've been in and the sort of experience you've accumulated. Often the really senior chiefs of staff have themselves become almost thought partners, strategic thought partners with their principals. There's sort of almost often aren't any staff of which they're chief anymore at that point. They're there literally to float across the organisation, as Kat said, to repeat ad infinitum what the vision is of leadership, to ensure that teams are keeping it front and centre of what they're doing. And it's less about that daily coordination, even for the chief of staff. It's more about that higher order strategic thought partnership that they can achieve and hopefully can achieve with their boss.
I think there's also an internal-external balance as well for a lot of principals and leaders. The more diverse the organisation, the bigger the number of employees or whatever it may be, there are different constraints. And if a principal is absolutely focused on something that's happening from an external perspective, the chief of staff keeps the lights on, right? They keep the fire lit, they keep things rolling and they keep them moving inside the organisation. And that can pivot, whether it's to deal with external people or internal people, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders. Once that rhythm between a chief and the principal is in place, it's effortless. And it really does just flow. And it's the things that don't get missed. People don't always know about them, but they don't get missed. That's when you have that secret sauce and it's all running in the same direction.
I love that. There's the two ways of looking at it. There's that the bigger piece, which is the strategic thought partnership. And there's the things that don't get missed. So the details are still being done as well. So I love that kind of full picture of how it works. It's a wonderful way of describing it. So so then the CEO's made the choice, right? Okay, I need to hire a chief of staff. How do you do that then? So Kat, because I'm guessing there's chiefs of staff out there, but it's a relatively new role. It's not something that, as an 8-year-old, we're like, yeah, I'm going to be a chief of staff when I grow up. Right? Talk us through your journey, Kat. How did you end up becoming a chief of staff? And then maybe Nick, afterwards, we can talk a bit more about other routes in the kind of career path to get there. How did you get to where you are? How did you end up as a chief of staff?
So my role's a little bit squiggly, I think is the correct way of saying it. So from a professional perspective, I was a qualified barrister, so I was called to the bar. I studied law. I then converted to a solicitor. And through all of that process, I worked in-house environments, and there's a state of mind, I would go to as far as to say in a chief of staff, which is a real doability. a real adaptability, that's a problem, actually, I'm going to fix that. You're not always asked to do it, so there's a lot of proactive behaviour in that role. I spent a lot of time doing that type of work, Joe, as I went through my career. I've had some fantastic leaders. I still have great leaders now, and that has been really helpful. But my role just expanded across my different jobs to organisation, to getting things done, to being that person that delivers, to being the person that's quite happy to put their hand up and say, no, I don't understand that. I need something more explained. So people knew that I was really going to pick it up and understand it and run with it. I also think it's about understanding the chief of staff's a real strange role if you think about it. It's really, really prominent, but equally invisible. So there's a lot of things that happen in many organisations where you are front and centre of all of the work, but your name is nowhere. And everybody knows you're behind that person. Everybody knows you're driving that initiative, but it just isn't the done thing, if that's the right terminology, to be like, as presented by the chief of staff. It doesn't work like that. You're there, and I say this on many occasions, my job, as I see it, is to make my principal look good. Is to make sure he's prepared, he's ready for everything, that his team are as prepared as they can be. And I can stand in the sidelines and watch that happen. It takes a certain type of person to accept that sort of invisibleness of the role, if that's even a word. Because I think as you go through your career now, whether you're a young EA, a very senior EA, whether you're in business operations, whether you're very organised, whether you're process driven, there is a bucket of principals or CEOs who need your skill set for a certain element of the work. But all of the other stuff that comes around it, your empathy, your need to let people vent, the desire to fix something and somebody comes along and goes, right, we're changing direction, boom, let that go, despite all of your hard work. You have to be resilient and not take it perfect. But you have to care about your people. My loyalty is my strongest sort of characteristic, but it will probably be my downfall. It works both ways. I think I got more and more adept at making things happen and taking great pleasure in a transformation or a project or a fix or helping somebody with their presentation skills, Joe. Like, it's really broad. I've had people who are really nervous presenting and I've helped them and I've coached them, and then you see them shine and then they go and they're successful and then you move on to the next thing. It's a phenomenally fulfilling role. I wouldn't do any other job. I love the chief of staff role, and I would argue that everybody I've worked for would say I eat, drink, breathe, live, love it. It's a great
So how
role.
did you find it then? Did the role find you, or did you find the role? Because it sounds like you were a very good fit for it. But did somebody say, "Hey, you should be this," or "I think you'd be this," or did you apply? How did you find it, the role, for example?
Well, I'm sure people say this all the time, but the chief of staff is, and Nick is by far more of an expert in terms of what I'm about to say, but people think of the chief of staff as you're in the White House, right? You're like with the president. We've all seen it. It's all amazing and it's all very exciting. And I think there's a little bit of nervousness around the word chief, right? People think that it either usurps the CEO or it has more seniority than somebody else. It really doesn't. Chief is just all encompassing. It is rolling your sleeves up and getting stuff done. And a colleague I used to work with, I won't name names, he said to me, he's like, oh my God, you are absolutely a chief of staff. But it's not a name that was recognised at the time, to be brutally honest. I then reached out to the organisation, the Chief of Staff Association, because I felt that actually I might need to be educated a little bit around what that role truly is, despite the fact that looking back retrospectively, I'd been doing it for 15 years. Sometimes it's not called that. And that's the other thing I would add, Joe, as well, is whether you're a director of operations, whether you're a project manager, a PMO, it doesn't matter sometimes what you're called. What matters is that the origin and the core of what you do, because that's how you measure the value that you deliver. I've worn lots of different hats. It hasn't changed the values that I drive. in what I do. And so I think the job found me almost by accident, and it's never been a better pairing, I would suggest.
A really nice way to think about it, because it sounds like that's true, right? Is that there's a lot of people out there who have the right skills, but it's identifying them within an organization and saying, then creating a role around that person and saying you'd be perfect as chief of staff. So Nick, tell me, how does the CEO go about finding somebody like Kat, right? How do they find somebody who's going to be their chief of staff if they want to do this? What's the best route to find people?
So I think it's several routes, and internally is a common one. I think many CEOs want to be assured of that sort of element of trust, of discretion. That rapport that's built up over time is really critical, I think, to the success of that partnership between principal and chief of staff. So I think often there is that sort of internal route. You've proven yourself, you're clearly capable of getting things done. You understand the organisation. You've got strong relationships right across the team. If a CEO is looking externally, I mean, many from a consulting background generally have that sort of training around project management, cross-functional coordination, that sort of analytical capability as well, which is key to the role. But I think it can be a really broad set of experiences that make someone valuable and a good fit. And I think the EA route can be, I would call it a significant minority of members who come to us. It's not the lion's share, but we do have some really strong EAs who come up through that pathway. Again, they've proven themselves in terms of coordinating the administrative support part of the role and the trust and the relationships there. But ultimately, they've acquired that sort of strategic outlook that's so critical to understanding the context within which they're supporting the principal and what they're ultimately there to do, bigger picture-wise. It's interesting that the chief of staff title, I mean, it's, again, I think thoughts generally do, as Kat touched on, go straight to the White House. I think it's an interesting one. And it can be seen, it does come with baggage. I think Kat's really nicely encapsulated the sort of temperament of a good candidate, that humility, that ability to sit behind the scenes and see something done, but not immediately get the credit. So the chief of staff title can, I guess, present a challenge as well to get that buy-in from those around you right across the organization. That will take time as well. So it's finding the person with the right skill set, which is your first challenge, but also crucially with the right temperament, judgment, discretion, all of the above. How do you actually do it? So we get a number of inquiries each week from certainly chiefs of staff or those aspiring to the role who are looking for that next opportunity, but increasingly from leaders of different companies who've come to that realization that now's the time. They might have already had the role within their structure. Often they don't. This is a specialized service. It's something we will do it ad hoc and we'll provide advice, and we do. But there are some really strong organisations out there. There are many of them. One which we've worked really well with in the past few years, Vannon Chief of Staff. They're based out of Denver. We work well with them. But there are a number of organisations that will provide...
that can support you finding it. Okay.
I guess in terms of the process, I think you could be really clear.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And probably the experience as well. So I'm also very curious when around the word authority as well, because it's come up a couple of times. I think, Kat, you've mentioned that as well. And is that... I'm guessing there's a level of authority that can come and should come with being a chief of staff. Can you talk to that, Kat, about how do you, because you can recruit somebody who's great at project management and data analytics and is really organised and does all of those things, but there's that element of authority that also comes with the role to a certain extent. Talk us through that. What do you, when I said the word authority, you smiled. What do you mean? What do you think I meant by that? And what do you think it kind of means in the reality of your day to day? How do you get it? How does it manifest?
So it's a tricky one, Joe, to be honest. I think authority can come from a multitude of directions. So I quite often would deputise. Okay, so I'll sit in a room, busy leaders and busy principals are often double, triple, quadruple booked in their diaries. And so quite often, I would go and sit in a meeting, listen, take notes. Where I had the knowledge and the ability and it wasn't controversial, I might say, yeah, no, we can go ahead with that. But that one needs to be reviewed. And it goes back to my point around that disseminating information. I'm taking back stuff that genuinely has to have a decision made at that level versus, yeah, this is a go, no go, and I can say yes or no to that. But the other levels of authority are really different about getting people to do things for you, because in order to facilitate action and change in a business, you have to have integrity, and you have to have reputational currency, I think is probably the right word. You know I can do it. You know I understand it. We've talked through this. I'm not asking you to do this for the good of my health, so to speak. And I've explained the reasoning behind it. And I think if you're open and honest, you build authority by the fact that you've asked for something, you've given exactly what you said you would, and you haven't moved the goalposts. You don't change the remit. And also as well, you don't blame. That's really important as a chief of staff. And I think, to go back to my humility point, you're not the boss. Be really clear. You have the boss's ear. You are involved in multiple conversations or situations across a huge plethora of situations, but you're not the boss. So it's having that ability to understand and say, I need you to do this because it feeds into this. And ultimately, the boss then steps in and says, yep, that's good. And then lower down in the organisation, the authority comes from almost by default, right? Oh, Kat's come to have this meeting. We obviously need to get something done. And that almost is a momentum that you create by the way you behave and how you deliver. And if you're consistent, that in itself gives you that default authority. And I think the other thing I would add is when you start off these relationships, and I'm sure Nick can add to this as well, when you're first connecting as a principal and as a chief of staff, between you need to be really clear. And one of the questions I think is really important to ask is, what is it you think that I don't do? Yeah. What is it that you think happens by magic? Because all those things that you think I don't do, honestly, they're all the things that I am doing. And I think when you're clear on that and you say, okay, what do you want to be involved in? What do you not want to be involved in? You can almost by default align on what you have authority to do and not to do. And big businesses all over the world will have matrix of authority. It's not about what you can sign or not sign or contracts you can enter in or not enter in. It's knowing if you say, no, I need you to stop doing that and focus on this, that they know it's coming from the right place versus you've missed something or forgotten something.
Fantastic way to look at it. Thank you so much, Kat. Well, thank you both for your time today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. So lots has been shared here. Kat, where's the best place for people to find out more about you or to connect with you if they want to?
So they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to have conversations, whether it's somebody starting out, somebody who just wants to, share problems and woes. It's an open door, and the resource at the Chief of Staff Association, I have to say, are second to none for me. They've been phenomenal. It's definitely a worthwhile membership.
Wonderful. Yeah. Nick, tell us more about the Chief of Staff Association, where people can find out more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're pretty omnipresent on the LinkedIn. People will have generally spotted us if they've ever searched Chief of Staff, and the algorithms have got them hooked. But we've got, of course, our website, csa.org, and feel free to reach out over LinkedIn to me or any other member of the team. And in terms of who we are, we've been around supporting Chiefs of Staff for the better part of 6 years now. And over that time, we have evolved that service offering, chiefly amongst the sort of education and certification piece, and bona fide level 3 certified Harvard alumna from one of our programs that we run. It's a really critical part of the work we do to professionalize the role, a role that's needing more of us to articulate what it's there to do and the value it adds. The network as well, I think a really important thing to note about it is often there's only one, and so it can be a really lonely role. So forming that community, creating a space and a forum where chiefs of staff can find their people and find sort of empathy and understanding of what they're going through day to day. And of course, it's the advocacy piece. It's the promotion of best practice. And we do that in lots of different ways as well, including those reports I mentioned and annual events, annual summits. So there are many ways in which you can get involved. We've got regional communities that people can sign up to as well upon joining. But Joe, thank you for having both.
Thank you both for your time. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thanks.